And now, Andy and RJ, would you like to start with your exhibition tour?
Great. Hello. Welcome to Pagkakaisa. Pagkakaisa is the Tagalog term for in unity or solidarity. It's a practice of kinship and defiance as it relates to the artists' roles in their communities, with backgrounds in frontline organizing, education. RJ and I analyze the tensions manifested by internalized racism and colonialism, connecting stories and celebrating empowering possibilities. We're exploring a future that's accessible and inclusive, resistance where approaches to dismantling oppressions are boundless and kind. And in it, I am a part of a glorious fight, but I won't continue without you. Yeah, I chose this particular term. I'm not Tagalog speaking, my family is Ilocano. And throughout the exhibit, you'll see that the pieces are in both Tagalog and English and French, just to kind of demonstrate the flexibility and that Filipino diaspora has had to be in different spaces that aren't their own. Yeah. And can go on to the next slide, I guess. Sorry, I also wanted to say that we aren't in the space, so we'll be showing you photos of the pieces. And so this piece is called Libération en fait, which means release, actually. So it's an installation piece that speaks to individual tensions and toils of trying to exist in spaces that are confined in multiple ways because of oppressions. And that the release of those tensions can be empowering and kind of symbolize the resistance. Next slide.
This one is called Barb Dreams. It's essentially a very industrial dream catcher. One of the things that I guess I had this kind of vision when I was hanging out with my friend Rana and Andy, and I thought about the imagery of a dream catcher that had barbed wire. So if we actually look closely at this, in place of where the beads were supposed to be in this dream catcher, it's actually barbed wire. And a lot of that goes back to feelings as if we can't be free unless we work together. I also was able to get a couple of gas canisters from my friend Rana, who she got from Palestine, because she's a Palestinian artist and activist. And those are what are hanging in place of the feathers that we would typically see in a dream catcher.
So this piece is called Malgré eux, which is despite them in English. And so this piece speaks to when we're talking about resistance and we're talking about building revolutions and really trying to build movements that are sustainable, we have to consider ourselves, the care for ourselves and our joy and pleasure. And so this piece was co-created by me and RJ. RJ, did you want to elaborate?
I made this hide flogger a while ago, and I thought it would be perfect to actually feature within this. And I think a lot of the times within our movements, we don't talk about the idea of being able to reclaim pleasure and to actually think of joy and what that can bring us. So I don't know if there's a closer picture of the images below. The one that I initially thought were potatoes, but are actually in the shape of different sex toys.
I don't know if there's like if I added a closer image of it.
But those little like black pieces of leather that you can see there.
Oh. So this piece is called Makibaka, which means to struggle and to fight in Tagalog. So it's a collage piece on a metal grid that's found, and the two humans that you see on screen are beloved comrades and activists who really have been inspiring a lot of this process and this work. And it's I guess like it's a 3D kind of collage piece where what I wanted to speak to was that movements, as much as it requires loyalty, it requires flexibility, and it requires the ability to look beyond a particular kind of dimension, to include histories of resistance, to inform like future movements, but to also think beyond what you can see as a possibility. And so you can see the piece, you could see them in like different angles as a result. And so this final piece is called Thank You. And if you go to the next slide, you can see it a little bit better. So this is like a found kind of like Niagara Falls memorabilia, where you can see like different pictures depicted of like idyllic, quote unquote, Canadian culture and life. And in the middle it says, I learned of my legacy and my ancestors through the harms made by yours. For this, I thank you. And so this piece speaks to like a certain amount of forgiveness and looking at internalized and intergenerational trauma from a different perspective, and using it to empower like future movements and to really reflect on, knowing oneself and one's place in positionality in a community.
Cool.
That's it.
Thank you. We had one question in the chat from Alice, and they'd like to learn a little more about the collaborative process for Niagara. Sorry, I can't speak French.
For Malgré.
Yeah.
I mean, I think what I've learned the most out of RJ is about pleasure and to make fun of pleasure. And I've never really seen it that way. Being part of the Filipino diaspora, my parents never talked about pleasure or even like shamed us for it, for multiple reasons, because they just weren't within the capacity to be able to make that space because of the different oppressive systems that kind of do that. But what I've learned from RJ and through their work is that it can be so liberating and so empowering, and yeah, just fun. Like it's, yeah, when RJ was talking about how I had tried to create this like very like abstract piece, and I had like spent quite a bit of time cutting out those leather pieces, and I'd shown it to them and they were like, well, this looks like a potato. And I'm like, well, great,
You asked what was it? You're like, what does this look like?
And it's like part of it is just having that humility, being like admitting that you like don't know, and that you're willing to learn, And through that learning process, you can find so many like great things about yourself, and like how like you can instigate joy even when you're like incredibly overwhelmed. Yeah.
Outside of the work, I guess like the ways that I like to use art is to kind of bridge the conversations of sexuality and sexual health to art, because I think that like generally like I am outside of this and in my day job like a sex educator, and initially when I became a sex educator I started to realize how inaccessible like conversations of sexuality are, particularly to like BIPOC communities. So I found it was incredibly important to kind of start to build those gaps and learn like why and what are the reasons why like there is a bit of struggle like in this area. And I think like kind of talking about that with folks who are like in my friend circles and just a part of other BIPOC communities to show them that, yeah, it's possible to have these conversations, even though it can be a bit intimidating. Because I know like when I initially first became like a sex educator, I felt a bit in over my head, because I found like these are things that I also struggle to talk about, but I had to, throughout like my job, learn why and what are the things that make this hard. And I found like through that, like learning ways to actually create like accessibility to sexual health, and I've actually used art to do that in doing like talking about sexual health even within my job, like being able to combine like just different like indigenous like teaching methods into like those conversations, and I bring that knowledge into a lot of my friendships because I think it's a really important skill to have. But also like these are things that the reason why we don't talk about this is because of colonization. And I think it's so important to be able to like reclaim and I guess rebuild those different parts of our life. But yeah, I initially thought they were potatoes, which I felt bad, but also zero context. She came to us and was like, hey, what does this look like? And I don't know why I had potatoes on my mind, but I'm like, yeah, they kind of look like potatoes.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another person who thought that too.
Even just like the position of the flogger as well.
Mm.
It's like teasing. Like the mat itself is like Filipino, and I thought that was very like reminiscent of of how RJ approaches things, which is great.
I also use deer hide for this flogger as well. And it's just fun because typically when we talk about like leatherwork in indigenous communities, we don't think of floggers. We're thinking of like regalias and like traditional things that we use. And the conversation of sexuality is so separated from that. And I don't like that, because I think these things are also inherently can go hand in hand with each other. Like, of course, given like being really mindful of like folks' trauma around like sexual violence too. I think that's also important. But how do we bridge those in really accessible ways? I use art because sometimes you can say something without saying something and say things in such a subtle way and just leave it up for folks to figure out how they feel about that.